Yeah, the Abbots said that they were going to be late, probably.
No, they're just totally out of town.
Okay. Yeah.
But Bob Abbott, being the good student that he is, he actually wrote up a response to his assigned section. He emailed it, and so I will be putting it in the chat here shortly. I will open us in our time together in prayer. And then again, I'd have one of you be thinking about who will close our time in prayer at the end of our evening together. I'm so glad to see you guys. Thank you for your patience with me for not being available last week and also for not recording. Again, I appreciate your patience. My finger is healing up well. For some of you who may not have got the word, my son tested positive for COVID Saturday night, which has had me really worried, of course, for him, but also that I would. As of yesterday, both a PCR test and the at-home test have both shown up negative, and my wife is also negative. And so keep the streak alive. Keep the streak alive. Let's open in prayer. Let's pray. Dear God, we give you thanks for this day. We thank you for the ways in which you have given us the opportunity and the time to be together and to grow in relationships, as geographically distant as we are from one another. We thank you that we have this technological means that enables us to be closer together. For our friends who are not with us this evening, we pray that you would grant them a dose of your love wherever they may be, and to knowledge that you love them. This evening, oh God, as we consider the topic of Israel and Palestine, we pray that you would humble our hearts and give us open minds so that we may engage understanding the way that would be right and just. We pray these things in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. All right. Well, so as I did last week, and first let me just say that I know that some of you have shared with me that maybe you didn't get some of my emails. I don't know why, but I've been hitting junk boxes over the last month. So, for those of you who are savvy enough to know how to make my email a safe email, you might consider doing so. And also just check your spam boxes or your junk boxes from time to time. And so that way we don't miss out on anything. Next week, I want to start off by saying what we're going to do next week. This is the last session that we will have using the handouts. And so for those who have been our guests, like the Denzins and Sarah and Diane and John and Hillary, next week it's specifically for the Pilgrims who are actually journeying, and the only thing we're going to talk about next week are all the final details, final preparation details for the journey to Israel. So friends, it is less than 2 weeks. The countdown has begun. So I want everybody wearing a mask, not just me. I want everybody washing their hands and staying away from people, so that we don't lose any of us, or that we don't lose any of us quarantined to a Tel Aviv hotel for 10 days. So let it be known, we've all been so advised. Tonight, we want to talk a little bit more about the history of Israel. And I think I've made reference a few times before that spot of land that is the current state of Israel has been, the soil has been fueled and watered with so much bloodshed throughout thousands of years. It's incomprehensible just how battled and how contested and how much historical tension has been over just the small spot of land, and we're going to be there, and we are likely to encounter some of the locations where we're going to be able to see evidence of some of these intifadas and wars and current. We're going to be going through a lot of checkpoints, and so we'll be seeing a good bit of present day security standards, which is nothing like the United States. And so I think I'm glad that the DOSes have included this as one of their handouts, because I think it is incredibly important for us to not go in totally doe-eyed. We're still going into a situation where a certain sense of reconciliation has never really taken place. And so I think it's important. My son asked me last week, we were talking about world cultures, and he was talking about world culture. In his world cultures class, they're focusing on South Africa and going through the history of apartheid and policies related. And he says, I just don't get it. I don't get why we have to learn it. It's not like, I'm ever going to need to know anything about South Africa. And now, as somebody who has studied South Africa a lot and has been there for a month, that was like a little dagger in the heart. But I said the same thing that I repeat now, which is, you've heard it before, which is, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that having a session tonight, I know Reeve, wave at the camera. Hello, Reeve. Reeve and I have had several conversations about American history, and I know that that's been an important topic for him. And so I think tonight, we put on sort of that historical hat so that we have a better awareness of the tensions that may precede us as we go into certain rooms. One of the locations that we're going to visit is an elementary school, or as a school, and that I've been there before, and I've met this person we're going to visit, and the ministry that they're doing, the good work that they're doing, is born out of so much of the tension and the strife that has happened within this part of the world. And so with that, let's do a little review, going through some of the history. So the first topic, the first bullet point on our list tonight, is the Roman Empire and the Maluks. I don't exactly remember. Let me look it up, see who was what.
It was alphabetical.
Yeah, so Abbots, Baker, Bertelsons, and Clark. Emily. And the Abbots are here. Abbots, I thought you guys weren't going to make it tonight. It's good to see y'all.
Well, I didn't think we were, but my friend that's an Uber driver, he got me home in 30 minutes from the airport, so
Nice.
it's pretty good.
Nice. Well, Bob, I told everybody that you wrote a response, and so I have just put your response in the chat for everybody. Do you want to go over it and talk a little bit about what you wrote, or just simply read what you wrote?
I can. I said, this is from the Romans to the Mamluk.
Mamluk.
Mamluks, Mamluks. Anyway, after Christ died and rose, the Roman rulers of Jerusalem destroyed the Jewish temple in 70 AD, and later they raised some sacred Christian sites. After Constantine converted to Christianity in 370, his mother, Helena, attempted to identify and reclaim religious sites associated with the life of Jesus. She's the one, I guess, that that decided where, like his grave was, and some other things that I don't know if it's exactly historically accurate, but that's what they've been going with since a long time ago. And after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire ruled Palestine from Constantinople until 638. A new religion headed by the Prophet Muhammad, by 638, the Muslims had Jerusalem under control. They built a mosque named Dome of the Rock on the destroyed temple site in Jerusalem. The Muslims and the Christian crusaders shifted control over Israel for the next 150 years. Then the Mamluks, Muslims from Egypt, ruled for 200 years, starting in around 1260. And if Marie wants to add, or Irene and Roger want to add something, or Emily wants to add something.
Well, I was just fascinated. I'd never heard of the Mamluks. So I spent my time, if you have any curiosity, the Mamluks have there's a very, very comprehensive Wikipedia page about the Mamluks. And they were there's a lot of Turkish influence from the Mamluks, and a lot of architecture and art, including the baptismal font of somebody that's in the Louvre that was created by the Mamluks. So anyway, it was. So if you want to know a little bit about the Mamluks, at least I'll give you the short version is in Wikipedia, and it was really interesting. It's not very short, so.
Excellent. Well done, everybody. I love it. Let's move on to the Ottoman Empire and the British Mandate. And we just have the Days and the Fulmers.
Hold on.
Oh, wait, Bertelsons. I
Oh.
apologize. Did y'all want to add
Yeah.
something to that?
Yeah, we just want to talk about the Crusades a bit.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, the Crusades. There was a. Well, go ahead, Irene. Go ahead. You got
okay.
more.
The first crusade was in 1096, and it happened. Well, Christians had been going to the Holy Land for a long, long time, and no problems. They were taxed, and it was a source of income for the Arab people, and everything was cool. But then there was a change of politics in the area, and the Turks were infringing on the Byzantine area. So the guy in charge of the Byzantines, who wasn't friends with the Pope anyway, he said, "Come and help me." And so the Pope said, "Fine." And he gave this edict that if you will go and help the Byzantines and go to the Holy Land, then you will be absolved of your sins forever, and you can go to heaven. Anyway, so that was the first crusade. And another thing that was interesting to me was that there was a big exchange of information. And at the time, the Arabs were more advanced in medicine and math and astronomy. And so the Crusaders actually learned a lot that they took home. And, the Crusades went on for a couple hundred years off and on, and they took some land and gave some came back, and it ended up with, they didn't get any land.
Yeah, I found that. I love, I especially remember that part about the idea of going on the Crusades would be penance, could serve as a form of penance for your sin. And I remember the first time I learned that, I thought, is that worth it? I don't know. Somebody's benefiting out of this, and I don't know if that would be me. But then again, maybe, I don't know. I guess we'll find out. Good. Thank you. And Emily, I didn't mean to skip over you. Did you want to add anything to it, or has it been covered? It's been covered. All right, let's go on to the Ottoman Empire. And tonight we have the Day family and the Fulmer family. Do y'all have something y'all would like to share with us about the Ottoman Empire to the British Mandate?
Well, the Ottoman Empire took over the Israel area in 1517 and were in power for 400 years. So that's a long time. The best thing, or the legacy that came out from their 400 years of rule, was that was related to land ownership and the property transfers In 1858, which is relatively current, they passed a law, so to speak, that all property had to be registered. And that was the first time that anything was written down, so to speak. And so some of those documents are still used today between the Israelis and the Palestinians in regards to whose land is whose. But they were defeated, then the Ottoman Turks were defeated in World War I. And that's when the British troops took over and occupied it in 1917. So that's what I've got written down.
Good. Days, do you have anything you want to add to that?
So I had never heard it called the British Mandate. So that was pretty interesting to me that in World War I, at the end of that, when the winners split up the world, that Britain was the one that got Palestine. I thought that was interesting, and that it's called was called the British Mandate, which I had never heard that term before, and so they, that was it until it became Israel, basically. So the Zionists came in and became more and more belligerent about taking their own country, and a lot of different countries in the world were doing that with Great Britain at that time, saying, you go back to that island that you came from, and we will run our own country. So that happened in Israel as well.
Yeah, I think the Zionist movement. Go ahead, Natalie.
And Bob's not here. He had to go to Dallas this evening. He's taking his mom to a doctor's appointment tomorrow, so he gets to visit Dallas and his mother and meet our brand new grand niece who was born yesterday.
Awesome. The Zionism, and I appreciate what Heather wrote in this about it being not a religious movement, but a nationalist one. And I look forward to talking to Heather about that, because I think, as you said, Natalie, there were a lot of these British territories that were striving for their own independence apart from the British Empire. And I don't know that I would describe their struggle for independence Zionistic. There's something very culturally appropriate for this interwovenness between people of the Jewish faith and the establishment of the state, different than some of those other territories. I do think that the word Zionism or Zion, it's a loaded word that intersects with faith as a nationalist movement.
Very much so. Yeah, I think Judaism is such a unique combination of faith and history and ethnicity and culture, in a way that most other religions are not. And so, so I found that to be a real interesting, it's a real interesting situation that they find themselves in. But I mean, the other thing about it is, in fact, they did come to that country, which was Palestine, and was populated by Palestinians who had been there for generations, and took it. And that's happened. That has also happened over and over throughout history. That's why we're where we are. So.
Yeah, well, and in that territory, as we've already seen, biblically and all the way through the mid 1900s. So, yes, thank you. Does anybody want to add anything to this section on the Ottoman Empire to the British Mandate? Judy?
Sure.
I just wanted to say this. Oh, go ahead. Who's else?
Judy, go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Judy. Go ahead, Judy.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, in the book that I'm reading in the Lemon Tree, that the Zionist movement began way back in the 1800s and was just a movement of a desire. The leadership of it was a desire to have their own country. And it survived, that movement survived throughout until finally they got, after World War I, then it became more of a reality, and with the other nations seeing that there was some validity in that movement, that they needed a space for the Jewish faith, or not the Jewish faith, but the Jewish culture people.
Yeah. Thank you, Judy. Bertelsons, you're all going to add something?
Yeah, just a note about the British Mandate. The book Lawrence in Arabia outlined that the Arabs were misled and are probably still smarting from the fact that they felt that in helping the Allies in World War I, that they would have a fair shot at their own territory. And so the British Mandate came out as a surprise to Lawrence in Arabia. Lawrence, who was very, very much involved in that. And then to the Arabs itself, they felt that they'd been really dealt betrayed. They really felt they'd been betrayed.
Yeah, thank you.
And so I think that still is a kind of a stick in their throat.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, I think that's a fair assessment. Thank you. All right, well, let's, did you want to add something, Natalie?
Oh.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the Holocaust and the Israeli independence. And tonight we have the Goebbels and Pastor Jeff, who wants to talk to us a little bit. Oh man, he didn't get it, darn it. So it's all on the Goebbels. Just let me pause for a second. Jeff, I sent you 2 emails in the last half hour, and you didn't get either of those. That's really unfortunate. And I'm sorry about that. If you'll take a look. Goebbels, why don't you go ahead? Oh, you got them now? Okay. Goebbels, why don't y'all lead us through the Holocaust and the Israeli independence? You know, fluffy topic.
Mhm.
Okay. Yes. The Jews began to fight back against the British governance in mandatory Palestine. That's what Palestine was called at that point, mandatory Palestine. And what the British government was doing, targeting, or the Jews, they were targeting symbols versus bombings. And Britain turned to the United Nations, which passed a resolution in 1947 dividing Palestine into 2 states. So you have the Jewish and the Arab. Full-scale war broke out on May 14th, 1948, that resulted in over 700,000 Arabs living in Israel becoming refugees in the West Bank. To the Israelis, this is known as their War of Independence. To the Palestinians, this is known as Nakba, or catastrophe. So you have completely two different worlds.
Gary, did you want to add anything to that?
One of the things that, yeah, I also wrote 3 or 4 sentences. Having faith across the large and ever-growing Jewish population in the Holy Land was chafing under the British rule and regulations, rebelling against the forces occupying the mandated Palestinian territory. It's apparently worked, this rebellion, because the British control was eliminated by the UN's division of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states, which was approved by the Jewish population but rejected by the Arab population. This in turn led to fighting between the Arabs and Jews and a large displacement that Carolyn mentioned, 700,000 Arabs from their homes. This fighting ended, I guess you could say it ended, in an agreement in 1949 that portioned the territory into Egypt controlling the Gaza Strip and Transjordan controlling the West Bank boundaries, and these are boundaries that remain relevant today. And I guess we're going to be crossing some of these boundaries when we get there.
Sort of.
One of the things I wanted to mention is the King David Hotel, in which it says 91. Yes.
Go ahead, Gary.
Go ahead.
Okay, in which 91 civilians were killed. It doesn't mention it in here, but it was the command center of the British government at the time. And that's apparently what they were going after. So it wasn't just trying to kill individual, citizens with nothing to do in the fight between the two sides.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think as you mentioned, the green line between Israel and the West Bank, that is something that we'll interweave through quite a bit. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in 2 sections from now, so that we can see how that has played out. When I was there in 2007, one of the places that we toured, and I know it's not on our tour, but one of the places we toured then was one of the refugee resettlement camps. And these were a huge population of Arabs who had their home in Tel Aviv area. And so after the 1947, after this movement, when they were sent from their homes or forced from their homes, they would go into these refugee camps. And while we were walking the streets and walking through the alleys in this area, at first when we arrived, there were all these kids and they're, running up on you. And we should remember to talk about the kids next week. But they were all running up on you and they're loving on you and, picking your pockets and, all those kinds of stuff. And we're getting a tour about, outreach opportunities, outreach ministries of other agencies, non-governmental agencies, organizations, tending to them as they live and have been living there for, at that point, 60 years. There's just this constant tension of this longing to go home, longing to be given permission to go back, and not only just go back to Tel Aviv, but go back and be given your ancestral land once again. And so after we were finishing up, when we were walking back, these kids, knowing that we were a group of American persons and not knowing anything more than Americans, started throwing rocks at our feet, or started throwing rocks, and they were landing by our feet. And it was really discomforting because we were there, in good faith, trying to understand the pain in which they were experiencing. And it was getting frustrating. I was at the back of the group, and then one just nailed me right on the center of my back, and it stung. And we were in this alley, and I don't have a quiet voice, and I was in youth ministry for a long time, and I have a youth minister's voice that calls to attention. And I screamed out, said, "Hey, stop it!" And the same voice I would use with teenagers, except that in that alleyway, it just reverberated. Blah, 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 blah. And next thing you know, windows started opening and like adult heads are popping out into the alleyway. Like, what's going on? And I thought, oh my God, we're about to have to make a run to the embassy. And these adults, they're yelling and screaming in their language, and they come running out into the alleyways, and I'm thinking, oh God, this is it. I'm toast. And they started yelling at the kids. What are you doing? Why are you? And the interpreter ended up telling us, what are you doing? Why are you throwing these kids? They are here to learn about us. They were here to listen, and so that we can share our stories with them. But part of what I learned in that experience is the ancestral nature of, these children had never lived in the Tel Aviv area. They've never traveled there because their permits don't allow them to travel there. But generation after generation after generation, they have inherited this disdain, this angst, this upsetness, the cultural story that has been taught down through the generations of that's our land and we were kicked out of it. Well, these 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds who've never been there, they're just born with that same sort of emotional attachment that has been passed down. And I think that there is examples of that in the United States. There's examples of that for sure in Texas. And but I think when we see, as we're going through there and we're going through all the different checkpoints, just how difficult it is, mobility to move freely in the land, just how difficult it is. You begin to see how that just adds, especially when we're in Bethlehem, how that just adds to this sequestered feeling, this, you know, eternal sequestered sense of almost imprisonment as a result of what's happening during this time period of the late 40s into the 50s. Let's move into the Six-Day War and the Second Intifada. The Hobbies, Kitty, and the Mungias. Who wants to take a swing and lead off with a few points?
Rudy's going to.
All right, Rudy. You got to unmute.
Maybe not.
There we go.
There he is.
Just press the right button. All right. Well, the Six-Day War in 1963 or thereabouts.
67.
67, excuse me, was a result of all the tensions that kept building up between Israel and the surrounding Arab countries, and somehow the Arab armies felt like they had the power, they were organized, they had the militia to go forth and recapture some of the land and do harm to Israel. They did not count on the good training that the Israeli military had been going through, younger troops, better equipment, and best of all, better intelligence. So with all of that, the war started, the war began, and just within a matter of days, and it's now called the Six-Day War, a matter of days, the Egyptian army was demolished. All of the surrounding Arab military was just frazzled, and then the headlines are reading the war, you know, has ended. So that's a brief overview of all of that, and I can go on, but I don't want to hog all the headlines.
I know, but you want to give Reeve a crack at it.
Maybe so.
Well, Reeve's going to have a map to show. Get the light forward here. Just to show you, Israel was the blue only and is back to being the blue only, but it got the Golan up there. It captured that. It captured the West Bank. It captured all of the Sinai Peninsula. The area of Egypt tripled during that Six-Day War.
Area of Israel.
Area of Israel tripled in that 3-day time.
6-day.
6-day time. The June War, which is another name.
Reeve, while you're holding that map up, give a little pinpoint to Gaza.
Gaza is that little strip right there.
Closer to the, well, no, closer to the Mediterranean.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at this backwards. So
there you go.
Yeah, that's it.
Right in there.
And to this day is an area that no one gets to visit, I guess.
Yeah, there's Israel surrounds it completely, and the coast, and so there is an incredibly difficult to get supplies in, and the economy of Gaza is incredibly dependent upon the grace of Israel for the most part, because they're not able to really participate in any trade or any other services to others. So that's a very difficult economy, and lots of impoverishment, lots of challenges there. Beyond the map, Reeve, did you want to add anything more after this?
No, I thought maybe Kitty, you have something to add to it?
I thought it was interesting that Egypt got bad intel from the Soviet Union that Israel was going to advance on them. That wasn't the case, and so they decided to strike. And then they found out about the power of the Israeli army, and yeah, they demolished airports everywhere.
Which we have to realize that the United States provided a lot of money to arm Israel. Although we were not actively involved, there always seems to
Not
be
till
some kind
later.
of a connection. And Kitty, I'm glad you brought that up, because when I read that today, all I could think of was the current news about
Right.
the Ukraine
Right.
and intelligence.
Yeah, yeah, I thought exactly the same thing,
Yeah.
right out of the headlines.
And yet again,
how about a
there's
little
Russia.
bit more? How about a little bit more with regard to 73 and 78 and some of the peace talks?
Yeah,
Rudy?
if I could add concerning the Camp David Accord, I don't know if that's what you have reference to.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, the Camp David Accord, we were, during the 60s and 70s, we were just still coming out of high school into college, and maybe not all that interested in the headline. But by 78, with the Camp David Accord, it kind of caught my attention with President Jimmy Carter, being able to get these two leaders together, Anwar Sadat, President of Egypt, and Prime Minister Begin of Israel, and coming out with the accord, and just having them together, all for a photo op, all for a coming to agreement on and actually shaking hands in front of all those photographers. Anyway, it left an image, a positive image in my mind, that that with a lot of hustle and a lot of good luck, perhaps there can be harmony, an effort at harmony, even if it's short-lived. But at least a seed can be planted. At least it appeared that way to me.
And Rudy, what caught my attention too is leaders that were really interested in peace and in justice in that area. Two of those men were assassinated. And that's just such a tragedy. I mean, I always pray for God to raise up just leaders for us. And here were people that were willing to make a difference and try to move forward in a peaceful way, and then they're taken off the playing field.
Yeah, that was really sad. Anwar Sadat was killed while he was viewing a military pass-through, and then somebody had live ammunition. One of the troops had live ammunition, and so it was terrible.
And
Josh, Gloria has a kind of a different take on this, if she might have a moment.
Go for it.
Okay, this is a little personal. Several years ago, before COVID, we had some men from Palestine at our house. We were hosting them through a program called Global Austin, which brings in professionals from all over the world. In this case, there were 3 men, highly educated. 2 of them have a PhD, one in mechanical engineering, and the other in computer engineering. And the other one, I don't remember. But anyway, they talked about Palestine and Israel and how difficult it is for them today to go from one place to another. they have to be checked and double checked and present all kinds of ID. And sometimes it's very dangerous. And he said, I hope that you don't encounter that kind of check, going through checking point. But if we do, we need to be ready. I would like to meet with these people and they would like to meet with us. Let me show you something they gave us. This was handmade in the Holy Land, and it is,
Yeah.
well, there it is.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see that.
Now, well, it
Yeah.
says Jerusalem at the bottom, and on the mirror, it says blessing for the home. May this home be blessed with love. May this home be blessed with peace. May this home be blessed with joy, happiness, and success. So I treasure this that they gave us. And also they gave us this plate, which I think they bought here because it's ceramic and it's called Blessing of the Home. But still, these are gifts that they brought us, and they recognized that this was a Christian home. I happen to have a picture, a painting of the Last Supper way above our kitchen sink. And I think they noticed it. And one of the men looked over and he said, "This is a Christian home." And he went on talking. So I really would like to meet with them. I've sent them our itinerary. So it all depends on whether they can come to us. And I also read this book, Jesus, A Pilgrimage. It's an excellent book that gives you a good insight from the Christian point of view, as well as from the Palestinian point of view. And I felt closer to the Palestinians after reading this book, Jesus, A Pilgrimage by James Martin. So it's just a little personal remark that I thought I'd add. And we are all aware that there's still that conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Yeah.
So hopefully we won't encounter any of that, but we've got to be ready.
And Gloria, you had shared a book with me. I think Kathy Morgan shared it with you. Faith in the Face of Empire. And it's written by a Palestinian Christian. And he's a pastor. And it just points out, right? And I've started and stopped this book a couple of times because I get interrupted by other readings. But it starts out making the point that the people of the land have always faced invading forces and invading powers. And if you think back to even the story of the Exodus, and when Joshua leads the Hebrew people into that land, it wasn't the Hebrew land then. God promised it to them, but there were people living there already. So I think the point is that we have to, change our mindset and take down national borders to try to understand that people, just like Native Americans, they had no concept of land ownership.
Right, exactly.
And it's a very complicated place we're going to visit.
Yeah. And this book is similar to that one. That's all.
Good, thank you. No, I appreciate that. That's good. The Emily, the book that you're talking about, the pastor's name is Mitri Rahib. We got to spend some time and visit with him at the Lutheran church there in Bethlehem. I think it's called Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem. And I spoke about that in a sermon not too long ago about these broken pieces of glass that members of that church had gone out from the wars, from these intifada's, and where a lot of these buildings, the glass was broken out and destroyed. So members of that community, to support their families, would gather up that glass that littered the streets from the buildings, and they soldered them into, they fashioned them into angels. So the glass were transformed into angels. And this is actually going into the 93 Intifada, where then, they were able to not only have just a whole, inventory of glass angels that were assembled and put back together from the destruction of the war, and to build these symbols of peace. But then just a few years later, at the birth of the internet, they were beginning to able to sell these things online and extend that out to a global economy. And if you think about Bethlehem, that is completely surrounded, where mobility is restricted or denied from Bethlehem residents, Arab residents of Bethlehem, much like in Gaza, the birth of the internet has really given an opportunity for many of those persons to have a sense of vocation, or generate income for their family. So this goes on into the intifada that happened in '93. And I think one of the things that we have seen time and time again, both with Carter, Clinton, and we've seen it through, it seems like Bush, Obama, Trump, is this effort to bring some reconciliation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So that is something that still continues to be an effort that American politicians have striven for. However, there's always things where it begins to fall apart. So just as there was this incredible historical moment of the meeting that happened at the Camp David Accords, there were things that caused it to fall apart. Just as there was another historical moment with the Oslo Accords, there were things that caused it to tumble apart. And for some, I think, Rudy mentioned with regard to the assassination, the idea is there are just some that solutions of peace are not to be pursued when there is an injustice. And so there are those who are Arab, who would say the only solution is a one-state solution, and that one-state solution is not the Israel state. There are Israelis and Christians who say the only solution is, there's only one solution, and that solution is only a full-blown Israel state. And then there are those who pursue peace and or an alternate path to the either or. But it's that tension, that the rigidity, the devotion to there's only one way for this to resolve ideology, that is what causes these things to continue to topple apart. No matter how much concessions, there's always those, or concessions or agreements that are made, there are those who will seek to undermine it because there can only be one solution. Let's get into talking a little bit more about the current issues. And tonight we have the Paynes and Diane. Why don't y'all talk just a little bit about current issues?
Yeah, but if the Paynes found things, I did go out online and looked up some stuff, but if the Paynes have something they want to share, they can start.
Yeah, Mike, Gene, let's start with you guys.
Just to go back a little bit, if you have some time and you can get a hold of it, watch Lawrence of Arabia. First thing will happen is you'll have to have a glass of water because you will feel like you're thirsty all the time. And the second, another one, if you have lots of time, get a hold of the movie version of Leon Uris' book, Exodus. And it'll carry you through the mandate and the birth of Israel. It takes 3.5 hours to do it, but it's really interesting to watch. And it'll lay the groundwork. You have the Palestinians who don't want the Israelis there. And you have the Israelis who want to be there. And you have this conflict has been going on since the birth of Israel in 1947. And there have been, various parts to it going on, but it ends up in the same way. You've got two intractable forces that are unwilling, in most cases, to find a solution. And if they do find a solution, they find a way to screw it up. And it gets more complicated because you now have the presence of Iran in this thing, who are trying to nuclearize their country. And if they achieve that, they are going to be a direct threat to the Israelis who see that. And if it happens, we're going to have I don't know what kind of problem we're going to have, but it's going to be really serious. And I hope there is some way that we can find to find a solution to this. But right now, I'd say, it doesn't look very promising based on all that's happened in the past. And a lot of the problems, sometimes the solutions that are worked out don't include the Palestinians, who are really almost the very center of the problem, because they're the people who have been displaced over all these years and have these resentments that have built up over a long period of time. And it's going to be really hard to make that work. And I think that's the major problem in Israel right now, is whether they're going to be able to survive or not.
I think that's an acute assessment. Thank you, Mike. I think you nailed that. Diane, did you want to add anything?
Well, I had gone out online and just looked up current events going on between Israel and Palestine. And something in the article I read that caught my attention, they talked about how the Israelis are limiting the Palestinians' freedoms so much, and economic freedoms, and that homes are destroyed and businesses are destroyed. And for some reason, as I was reading that, it made me kind of think about the Holocaust and how the Germans treated the Jewish people. And it's almost like the Israelis seem to be treating the Palestinians much the way the Germans treated the Jews.
I read an article in the Wall Street Journal last week that, and I guess we have to be careful who's writing the articles.
Concentration camps, but economically, and maybe I'm missing, I don't know who wrote this one that I read. I'm not sure, but.
Yeah, Diane, you're chopping up, but I think we got that there. And Jean was jumping in. Go ahead, Jean.
Well, I read this article in the Wall Street Journal, and Amnesty International was filing some charges against Israel being apartheid. And so this person, who was a professor emeritus at Ben Gurion University, was saying, and I'll just read you a couple of things: 1.9 million Arabs living within borders of pre-1967 Israel are full citizens. Palestinian citizens of Israel can vote in national elections. Their right to political participation is limited, but they say, but it's not, supposedly not true. Israel Arabs have enjoyed equality as the country's Declaration of Independence promised. They are free to express their political views. Their freedom of movement is unrestricted, and they vote in national and local elections. They're fully represented in the Knesset. Anyway, again, this is one person's point of view, and I guess it depends on whether they're in favor of the Palestinians or the Israelites. So we just need to be open-minded and careful about what is. They also said something about how the Israelis tried to modernize farming for the Palestinians and help provide them with modern appliances and things. So that's what I read in this Wall Street Journal article.
Okay, thank you.
Interesting.
I would, in response to both Diane and to the pains, this is where it gets to be a really sticky issue, is the idea of the state of the conditions in Israel Palestine, and the concept of that you elevated, Diane, with regard to the behaviors and actions of the state of Israel as apartheid, right? And that's, you know, I'm not saying that's what you said, I'm saying that's what you reported, has been reported and elevated in a number of places. And there are similarities, although I myself wouldn't necessarily categorize it the same. Now, our denomination that Hope is a part of, Hope Presbyterian Church, in January, our chief grand poobah of our denomination on Martin Luther King Jr. Day had made some of those very same comments, right? Drawing the similarities between Israeli occupation of Palestinian areas and apartheid. And he received a seismic amount of backlash, to which he had to come back and reissue a statement explaining that a little bit more, because it was felt by many, especially those within the Jewish community, as anti-Semitic. And there becomes a difficulty in naming the concerns of the policies and actions of the Israeli state by naming them as injustices. Many times can be associated as or be misunderstood as anti-Semitic. And I think we may get a chance to see some of those places as we're journeying. Okay, this doesn't look good. This is not good. This is the result of policies that were made by the Israeli state, the state of Israel. And I'm very cautious to say that these are government decisions versus individual decisions or decisions made by the Jews. These are governmental decisions that had this sort of impact. And they were easy to see when I was there, and we may very well still be able to see the impacts of those decisions. Really, one of the largest things that continue to be a big issue is, as Reeve talked about earlier, the Green Line. Was it Reeve who said about the Green Line? Who was that? Was that Rudy? The establishment of that line, and this is the boundary between where the state of Israel is and the West Bank. And what has happened a great deal, and it's recorded over and over and over and over and over again, and is unstopped, is that the state of Israel is building and establishing settlements on the West Bank side of that Green Line, and just slowly edging in, and not only just claiming a lot of the fertile land that is available for agricultural purposes, but also displacing the people who were living there that was rightfully on that agreed upon Green Line. And that is what causes a lot of issues. And so initially there was not a wall that was erected between Israel and the West Bank. And as these settlements began to take place, and as the encroachment into these agricultural areas began to take place and take root, that is when fostered a lot of terrorist actions, a lot of conflict from the Palestinians or from Arabs against Israelis. So part of the solution is, well, let's build a wall. So they built this wall, and when they built the wall, which was supposed to be along the Green Line, there's quite a number of places where it's not on that line. It's on the West Bank side of that line where they built the wall. Or they would do like what we'll see in Bethlehem. They built the wall completely surrounding Bethlehem, and therefore any persons who were not full citizens are remanded to just that spot of Bethlehem and not permitted to. There's no shortage of persons who have lived and never been able to travel outside of, or permitted to travel outside of Bethlehem. So I think the Wall Street Journal article that Gene elevates, I think that is an argument, a perspective, an opinion that does often get elevated, much like here in the United States. There is, well, everybody has the right to vote. Everybody has the right to, and access to being able to do these things isn't the same as the freedom to do so, which I think is a whole nother systemic issue to examine on another day, but not today. But I think the last thing I'll say, I'll go to you, Bob, is talking about these things is where we need to tend to be cautious, especially in mixed company, who it might be easy to find ourselves tripping over our tongues and causing an offense when no offense was intended, just simply because there's a context and a story there that we might not have understood as faithfully and as fully, or as we may oversimplify something that is not easily simplified. Bob?
Well, I happen to disagree with what Diane said about the Nazi business, because I don't believe that, I do believe Israel's done some wrong things and to the Palestinians, but I have been to Auschwitz myself, and I've seen the piles of people's glasses, and those were in the suitcases, and all those people were killed. And that's not what the Jews are doing in Israel.
Yeah, I don't know that that was Diane's argument. I think she was just simply reporting what she had. Those perspectives are out there, and what I took away from Diane was there's more similarities with apartheid policies than the Holocaust. Diane?
Yeah, I mean, I was just really reporting on an article. I guess, it does seem that there have been cases of where Palestinian freedoms have been limited by the Jewish people, but yeah, apartheid is much more accurate, I think, analogy there. And the article did mention apartheid in it. It never mentioned anything about the Holocaust at all in any way.
Thank you.
So I maybe spoke wrong when I kind of rephrased everything.
Sure. Judy?
I have a very simplistic question. I just don't understand in 1947, when all the history of the Jewish people and the Palestinian people had been going on for hundreds of years, if not thousands, why two countries weren't formed at that time. I'm sorry.
It's so your face is right next to Natalie's cat's rear, and I had to stop for a minute. Could you start your question again? Because I have your face and Natalie's cat's rear at the same right next to each other. So
I can't compete with that. My question is, I just cannot fathom why in 1947, after the Jews had been so mistreated by the German people, they did not also consider the history of the Palestinians and the Jewish people, and two countries be formed at that time. Can somebody give me a simple answer for why that was not considered as a possibility? Because they just set this whole problem up to continue and become worse and worse and worse, because the Jewish people, of course, are infringing on the Palestinian people that have lived there for centuries. I don't get it.
So on not this shelf in my office, but on another shelf over to the side of my office, there are this many books written on the topic. I wish, dear friend, I wish there was a more reasonable, sensible answer to what you're asking. I don't believe that there is, and you know, there are times when I wish I were alive during that to have better understood the context, the historical happenings of the world as they happened and unfolded in that time period. I think from a 2022 perspective, looking back, I think the world had just suffered such a massive trauma, that the world itself had just suffered such a massive trauma, and just those, you know, it wasn't that the world knew that there were 6 million persons who died in the Holocaust. It's that they found that out, you know, the world didn't know those things were happening to that extent as they were happening. And then, so there's this just massive trauma plus the Pacific War. And I mean, all of this is happening all over the place. And I think, as a pastor looking backwards, I just think about the impact of the trauma on the state of the world, and decision making and trying to pull things together, which, you know, clearer heads prevailing today, maybe we would have set things up, especially as we're not in the midst of a crisis, a trauma right now. But that's all I can think about for the most part. And maybe there was some easier way to, maybe the solution that was put forward was an easier path towards peace, a path towards restoration for a people that had been so traumatized and suffered under a genocide. But there is that geopolitical angst that doesn't seem to have been attended to as well, right? And some would argue that yes, they had lived there for hundreds of years, right? But they had displaced Israelis or the people of the Jewish faith to begin with. So it's the people of Jewish faith reclaiming the land that God had given them. And I think really when we, you know, the other aspect of that is to not minimize in any way the power of Christian Zionism. And Heather doesn't write about that in this article, but the power of Christian Zionism as a massive effort for establishing the nation of Israel and purging that land of all non-Jews is a powerful movement that is still in full effect today. There is Christian Zionists hold this idea that the establishment of the full control of the land that God had promised God's people, and the rebuilding of the temple is what will hasten the return of Christ. And therefore, you get a huge, powerful push by people of the Christian faith to be, you know, 100% pro-Israel in every way, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and that has a massive, that begins to take a massive root, especially in the 60s, and significantly so in the 80s and the 90s, especially, you know, after the Camp David Accords leading into the early 90s. This is a huge thing that is happening. Maybe I wouldn't say it's covert, but it's not happening, like the mechanisms of that aren't just as visible as other mechanisms, but this really started to take a huge root in the 60s, in the early 60s, with regard to Christian Zionism. So that's not a simple answer, but maybe that's the best I can give you. Who else thought maybe they could take a swing at answering that one? I love it how Jeff is always silent. Where'd Jeff go? There he is. I love how he's always just along for the ride and leaves me to hung out to dry.
I just wanted to say that I don't think it was, I mean, I agree with you, Judy. I wish there was an easy answer, but my history on this is not the greatest, but I think they screwed up the whole Middle East after this. I mean, Iran, Iraq, the borders there are all wrong. I mean, they just screwed the whole region up. So.
Well, hey, the Middle East was screwed up even before this came along.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
And one of the things that I always have to remind myself is that people make decisions in the time that they make those decisions. And they make those decisions based on what they know at that time.
Right.
And so they come up with these solutions, and 50 years past that, it's real easy to look back and say, hey, you screwed it up. You should have done this. Well, no, they did what they could do based on what they knew at the time and all the stuff that goes around it. And, the birth of Israel came out of the desire for those people to move back there, and the British, along with the United Nations, or the League of Nations, and then the United Nations, in order to fulfill that desire and promise. And, that's what was done. Those were the reasons it was done. Now, we may not think it's a really good idea today, but at the time it was, and that is the only way to make an operation. You can't spend your life looking back at what you ought to have done. You look at what you did, and if it's messed up, then you have to fix it. And that's the problem today, is trying to find a way to fix this.
There's a book called Paris 1919.
Yes.
That was written at the conclusion of World War I.
Yep.
When the major four parties of World War I got together and carved up the Middle East. Okay.
Yep.
And the last, there's the quote that or a conversation between President Wilson and his wife as they were going out to catch the Queen Mary or whatever it was, and is what we have done. And Wilson's answer was, we have succeeded in screwing up everybody.
I agree.
Judy,
Pretty much his quote.
Judy, I'm going to quote Lin-Manuel Miranda. You had to be in the room where it happened.
The room where it happened.
Wow.
But being a teacher, I still think they didn't do their homework. I didn't think they didn't look back far enough to all that had been going on between those people. And even the fact that Jesus was rebuked by his own Jewish people, and he went to the Gentiles and did his preaching to the Gentiles. So that's the Palestinians. That's all the other people that lived in the country. I mean, they're just they messed up. They messed up. You're right.
Well, the other part of that I would add to that, Judy, is I think you're right. I think the other part of that isn't to be discounted is persons who are in the room where it happened are people who have power. And the further that power is removed from the realities of those on the ground, the more they lack intimacy in those decision making. And so in order to make decisions that are keenly important, especially for those who are on the ground living into those realities, power needs to be closer to it. And that often happens. I think that still happens all around the world. And we see evidence of that. We see decisions that get made about the coal industry and environmentalism that, but we don't see the intimacy of the impact that has on the lives of the ones who are sustained by that industry. And, but when you're that far removed, you really are just, you're playing chess over the phone. You're not there on the board. And I think that's something that I would reflect on myself is I wonder just, while there was some tacit understanding of the complexities of it, when you're that far removed, I mean, I don't know about the 1919 Paris book, but my guess is that's resulting you know, that you see, you have all these persons who are in the positions of power making these decisions far removed from the impact that those decisions are going to have on the ones who have to live under the burden of it, those who are going to be displaced from Tel Aviv and be forced out of their ancestral homes. You know, the people in the room where it happened, they're never going to have to face those people. And they just become, you know, collateral at that point. And I think that's important to remember too. But when you're one of the ones with the power, right? When you're one of the ones who gets to make those decisions, and you're in the room where it happened, Emily, you've ruined me. I'm going to have that in my head all night. You know, you can get what's the right word? Infiltrated. Infiltrated from everything, right? From everything, and you just continuing to. I had this analogy once where I used to call it like the dirty diaper syndrome, right? You know, nobody likes a dirty diaper, you know, except for the baby who says it's mine and it's warm. And, you know, and when you're in that kind of isolation of power, you're not really thinking about all this other stuff that could be impacting and influencing in that regard. One of the reflection questions, and we'll just kind of sum up on this, is explore the meaning of the phrase, history is never neutral. What examples can you think of where the historical narrative has been used to support a particular political perspective or elevate a particular group of people? And that's some of what we're talking about to some degree. But where else, for my armchair historians, where else might we see examples of that outside of, you know, outside of the Middle East or outside of Israel? Where else might we, Bob?
Well, it was interesting because in my training as a docent for the Bob Bullock Museum, part of our training involved perspective, and that history is always told by the perspective of whoever is telling the story, and how, you know, some people at times had questioned the perspective that the Bullock had used to tell the story of Texas. And it's interesting because as my time as a docent there over about 10 years of time, the perspectives were changing to include much more the Hispanic perspective than had been done originally. And so I think anytime you see any kind of history portrayed, whether it be a book, a movie, a museum exhibit, you know, any discussion, you have to look at who's telling the story.
Good. Thank you. Bob, then Emily.
Well, I was thinking of how after the Civil War in the South, they made monuments for Robert E. Lee, and he was perhaps the worst traitor that this country ever had. But, you know, that wasn't the story that was told until recently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. You're right. Post Civil War, the fashioning of the narrative of how that went, that got memorialized not only in monuments that are erected, but also textbooks and oral tradition. Emily, then Emily Clark, then Emily Hobby.
Well, to go back to your point, the people in the room were probably not the Arabs.
Yeah.
And therefore they got excluded from that conversation.
Yeah.
They were the rest. They were just the white folks from England and America and Russia.
Yeah. So yeah, again, where the power is concentrated, you're talking about colonizing power. countries that had been doing that for a long time. So your question, I think, is important, is who wasn't in the room where it happened?
Right.
That's important. Wow, that's great. Yeah. Emily Hobby?
Well, my history teacher said history is a pack of lies written by the winners. And I mean, we're living that experience ourselves, I think, in our American society right now. And I think Michael kind of got to this point. This whole thing, we can't. Things have to be told truthfully. We don't want to feel. We're not trying to make other people feel guilty. We want to say, okay, this is what's happened. How can we live together better and move forward? And I think Mike Payne was trying to, he said, kind of was saying that in his statement earlier, that, you know, we can feel really badly about these things and we can keep second guessing, but it's not going to get us out of the hole we're in. We have to say, acknowledge it, acknowledge the truth. How can we make it better? What can we do to work together now to move forward? And you have to have willing parties to do that. It's like a marriage.
Good. Anybody else want to offer anything before we move to closing? Rudy?
Yeah, Josh, I think all this conversation kind of is eating around what is happening right now in the classrooms, both at the public education and now in today's headlines, the university, about the critical race theories, so that if you were not in the room when the decisions were made, and you try to correct some of and update some of the history to the way it really happened, then there are other forces that may come and want to say, no, we don't want to hear that part. We know how, we're the ones who wrote the history or something like that, and we don't want to hear the other side. So that is a very current events issue that is taking place in our public schools and in our public universities. So that's kind of coincidental how it all kind of comes together.
Yeah, I think that's an important perspective, Rudy, and I appreciate you saying that. I've often talked about getting hit upside the head with the truth stick. It hurts, and that is something that many of us would want to dodge and try, because it doesn't feel good. And what feels good is what we know. And it's hard to accept that perhaps what we've been that some things that we've been taught may not be reality. And I know we're talking about like societal history, but I want you all to think about with regard to family, within your own family, as you're a child and or a young adult, there are things that you understand about your family that as you become middle-aged, you learn more of the story, and it completely fills in and perhaps gives you a better perspective of your parents, your grandparents, the nature of things, the way that the conditions of, and there are some truths that we begin to face as we, the older we get and the more that we begin to experience things. And so I think that sort of thing is also what we begin to see as the national family, the family that we live together in this country we call a home. And I think you do begin to get examples of that. I had a class in college called Who Owns the Past? And the answer to that in my final paper was, well, whoever wrote it, that's who owns the past. And part of the work that we did then was, don't tell anybody, because this was like 1997, was what is now called, critical race theory. But it would truly, apart from race, was simply saying, here are two historical narratives written side by side, and this is the story that we know, but here's this story And here are the actual historical factual events that took place as a result of this. And how do you begin to reconcile, especially with what we elevate as that's the story? And I'll just simply say that my world was rocked about 4 years ago when I learned more about the story of the Alamo, because I had only ever known the story of the Alamo that they taught me in 7th grade. And as I learned more about the historical truth of the historical accounts 4 years ago, I just felt like, you know, is the sky really blue? Is my name really Josh? You know, and it was I had to rebuild on and taking that information in, which I think is important about this trip that we're doing, going to Israel, and understanding these contemporary issues as we tread upon these very sacred lands that I know that I have always revered and held sacred, the land of the Alamo, and it is still revered and is still held sacred. And how do I honor its space and being in that space while also honoring the history that is factual and recorded? And I feel like we're going to be experiencing some of that as we travel through many of these sacred places as well. So thank you. This is a really healthy conversation, and I really appreciate what y'all have contributed to this tonight, and I'm looking forward to being a pilgrim alongside y'all on this journey. I want to say that next week, as I mentioned earlier, it will be just for the travelers who are going, and we're going to sum up all the final details, and everybody is going to wear their mask and stay healthy, and we're going to talk about all of, and I say we, I mean like Eric and Heather are going to talk about all the details, because I don't know a darn thing about what we're doing. I am every bit as much as along for the ride as you guys, and while we're on the journey, I'm going to defer all leadership to Eric and Heather, and I just get to be alongside and a pilgrim with you guys. So I'm pretty excited about that. Would someone like to
I just want to make a comment before we close.
Please.
I just got a text from my daughter saying that my grandson, who's at UT, just tested positive for COVID. And so now I guess we won't be having them for dinner on Sunday, he and his cousin, and I guess we'll be a little bit more careful.
I thought he said there was a negative.
He tested, I know, but I think it's still bad omen. He tested positively, and then he went to Terrytown Pharmacy for $175, and they gave him a negative test. So,
oh, interesting.
Yeah, I guess it just costs money. I don't know. So we'll be more careful than we would have been.
Good call, Irene.
And I would like to thank you all for allowing me to join in with the classes I was able to attend to learn about the trip. And I wish everyone a safe and wonderful journey. And I look forward to hearing about your trip when you all get back.
Thank you, Diane. Thank
you all are in my prayers for safe travel.
Irene.
We scheduled our PCR test today at the CVS around the corner, and it was super easy, and the schedule was wide open. So we got them scheduled for the Sunday afternoon, but they do it, and it was really slick.
You were scheduled on Sunday?
Right. We scheduled our test for the Sunday before we leave in the afternoon. Eric had said to try to schedule it Sunday if you can, or Monday if you can't do it, but their schedule was wide open.
Yeah.
At the CVS
Irene,
yeah.
When you schedule a Sunday, you're going to be more than 72 hours.
Be 72.
The flight's 5:45.
They look more a day. When we went to